Hello and welcome to the September Lunchbox lecture at the National D-Day Memorial. I'm John Long, the Director of Education. It's my privilege to welcome you here for a fascinating talk on, although we're indoors, a beautiful day here in Bedford, Virginia. We're looking forward to a great presentation. Our guest today is Ben Brands from the American Battle Monuments Commission, which this year is commemorating its 100th anniversary. And what better time for a special program than in the centennial year of something going on. Ben is a historian with the ABMC and a PhD candidate at George Mason University. He has previously served as an infantry officer in the United States Army and with combat deployments to Iraq and to Afghanistan. He taught history at West Point, the U.S. Military Academy, and at Oregon State University. And he is also the primary author of this really fantastically beautiful book beside me on the history of the ABMC that commemorates the fascinating history of this organization that a lot of you may never even heard the name, but I guarantee you're familiar with their work. And so, Ben, it's great to have you. I'm going to turn it over to you and tell us all about the last 100 years.
Thank you, John. So I'm a historian for the American Battle Monuments Commission, as John said, and I appreciate the introduction. And he certainly has highlighted something that I like to say that, more people know about Normandy American Cemetery than know about American Battle Monuments Commission, which runs it. So today I'll talk a little bit about the history of ABMC and how we've evolved and stayed the same over the last 100 years. So if you can bring up the slides. To start with, the American Battle Monuments Commission is a small federal agency. We're about 450 employees, only about 90 of whom are American citizens. And our mission is to administer America's overseas military cemeteries and monuments, mostly World War I and World War II, but we have some sites that we've added over the years for other conflicts as well. We have today 26 cemeteries and 32 monuments spread across 17 countries around the world. Our World War I and World War II programs include 125,000 burials, as well as 85,000 names recognized on our walls of the missing. We also have, at our Honolulu Memorial, recognized the 8,200 missing from Korea and the 2,500 missing from Vietnam. And in our three non-World War cemeteries, we have an additional 15,000 burials representing American wars from the Mexican War all the way to the global war on terror. But this is our centennial year, and ABMC was founded in 1923, but its origins really date to the massive death of World War I. World War I was in many ways a watershed in American military history, and certainly a watershed in the way the American government and people related to its war dead. During the war, the dead were buried close to where they fell in temporary cemeteries, and this was the work of the Army Graves Registration Service. When the war ended in 1918, there were over 80,000 American remains buried across Europe in over 2,000 temporary cemeteries. And so as the war came to a close, America was faced with two questions. The first question was what to do with the American war dead buried across Europe. Now, there was a great deal of debate about this in America, in both the government and in the general public. Some wanted every American to stay buried close to where they fell in the battlefields with their brothers in arms, the way that the British conducted their war cemeteries. Other Americans felt very strongly that every American who died in World War I should be brought home to their family in America. And eventually the government decided to allow the next of kin to choose. They were offered the choice. They could have their loved one repatriated to a cemetery of their choice in the United States. And that could be Arlington National Cemetery, one of the national military cemeteries spread across the country, or in their private family cemetery or church cemetery. They could also elect to be permanently interred in an American military cemetery overseas that would be cared for in perpetuity by the United States government. In the end, about 40% of families elected to have their loved ones interred overseas. The other question going on at the same time was how to properly commemorate the achievements of American forces during World War I. And one of the things that we wanted to avoid was the example of Gettysburg. So you'll see on the left here a monument erected by a unit right after the war for World War I, and then a picture of Gettysburg. And so as soon as the war ended, individuals, units, states started to erect monuments across Europe to their loved ones, to their comrades, to their native sons. But we wanted to avoid this kind of proliferation of monuments, ensure that the monuments erected in Europe were both of a suitable grandeur to the achievements and sacrifices of the AEF, as well as that they would be permanently cared for. And so, to solve both these problems, in 1923, Congress created the American Battle Monuments Commission, originally charged with designing and constructing a series of monuments across Europe to honor the achievements of the American Expeditionary Forces. Soon after the establishment, the agency was also given the mission of designing and building non-sectarian chapels at each of the 8 permanent military cemeteries. Over the course of the next decade and a half, the commission constructed 11 monuments and 2 markers to the achievements of the American Expeditionary Forces. You see a couple of examples here on the left, Montfaucon, as well as Montsec, both an exterior view and an interior view of the battle maps. In addition to the monuments, ABMC designed and constructed the 8 permanent cemeteries. These cemeteries encompass 31,000 burials with an additional 4,400 names inscribed on the walls of the missing for those whose remains had not been recovered or identified. In 1934, President Roosevelt conveyed to the American Battle Monuments Commission the responsibility for caring for these in perpetuity. Originally, during the reburial process, these had been under the charge of the Army through the Graves Registration Service. They were handed over to us in 1934. In 1937, actually, before I go to the dedications, these are not just graveyards. In addition to the grave plots that are beautifully laid out, these cemeteries were marked by chapels and memorial architecture to help commemorate the meaning of the sacrifice of those buried here. Here you see an example from Ain-Marne American Cemetery. And I think this gives a really good example of the kind of combination of classic as well as contemporary images used in the art and architecture at our sites. Above the gates, or above the door to the chapel, you can see the figure of a crusader. But the pediments of the columns on either side are made up of doughboys in various wartime scenes from World War I. And it's a really powerful juxtaposition that adds to the gravity of these sites of remembrance. Now, most of the construction was completed around 1934, 1935, but because of the Great Depression, they're not formally dedicated until 1937. So in 1937, there's a series of dedication ceremonies held on Memorial Day, with all 8 of the cemeteries being dedicated simultaneously. Now, of course, what no one could know when these ceremonies were held is that in 1937, we're actually closer to the outbreak of World War II than we are to the completion of World War I that these sites honor. But shortly after the dedications, the outbreak of another global war makes it clear that America's responsibility to its war debt is not over. This war cost the lives of over 400,000 Americans, and the global extent and just sheer scale presented a unique problem for America after the war. Once again, we face the same questions we do after World War I. How do we care for the dead, and how do we honor the achievements of those who fought and died? World War II is a little bit easier in some ways because we had the example of the World War I program, and it's rapidly decided to follow that model for World War II. So in 1946, President Truman issues an executive order that expands ABMC's mission to encompass the World War II commemorative program, specifically the construction of permanent military cemeteries overseas. Now, because of the geographic extent of the war and the sheer scale of burials, it is soon decided the way there was in World War I. For this reason, The World War II cemeteries feature much more elaborate art and architecture than the World War I companions. They are designed to fulfill a dual role, to be both cemetery and memorial, and united in one site represent both of those functions from the cemetery and monument programs of World War I. Once again, somewhat shockingly, the next of kin response is almost statistically exactly the same as in World War I. 40% of families elect for overseas interment. This results in the creation of 14 permanent cemeteries with over 90,000 burials and an additional 79,000 names inscribed on the walls of the missing at each site. This list of missing is completed by 3 memorials built in the United States. The East Coast Memorial, which honors those who lost their lives in the Atlantic coastal waters. The West Coast Memorial performs a similar mission for those who lost their lives in the Pacific coastal waters. And then the Honolulu Memorial, which includes the names of the missing for a portion of the Pacific Theater. The Pacific is represented by the Honolulu Memorial, as well as the Manila American Cemetery. And then in kind of a weird one-off case, there's also the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, located in Honolulu. Now that also receives permanent overseas burials from World War II, specifically those who died fighting under the command of Admiral Nimitz. But because it is in Hawaii on American soil, we do not own it. That is administered by the National Cemetery Administration, which is part of the Department of Veterans Affairs. So as you can see here, you can see a little bit of the World War II sites. That's Brittany American Cemetery, the statue of youth triumphing over evil, as well as a picture of the grave plots at Lorraine American Cemetery. Now, I'm going to focus a little bit more on Normandy because of the audience today and the venue today, but all of our sites follow similar patterns for their design and construction for World War II. This is Normandy American Cemetery, of course, by far our most famous and by far our most visited cemetery. There's over 9,000 burials here, as well as an additional 1,500 names inscribed on the walls of the missing. Those burials and names include 10 of the Bedford boys, 8 in the grave plots, and an additional 2 on the walls of the missing. But I want to talk a little bit now about the design of our cemeteries. So our cemeteries are not just graveyards, as I said. They're comprehensively designed as sites of remembrance to honor those who are buried there, those who are memorialized there, and I would argue, especially for World War II, all those who died and fought during World War II. And so each incorporates a number of elements to make that possible. As I said, the World War II sites serve that dual role of both memorial and cemetery. And so for that reason, each one features at least one major piece of art, usually sculpture work, as well as additional art sprinkled throughout the cemeteries. Now, you can see here, this is the main piece of art at Normandy American Cemetery. This is a sculpture called The Spirit of American Youth Rising from the Waves, tied very closely through the use of symbols and allegory to the D-Day campaign, that amphibious assault on Fortress Europe. It's not the only art there. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the other pieces, but what I really want to highlight is, our cemeteries work together. And so the grave plots and those kind of iconic view of the row on row of white marble crosses and stars of David, really powerfully convey the sacrifice of American youth and American service members during World War II. We use art in our cemeteries to help convey meaning to that loss. And so most of our art makes rich use of symbolism to kind of, give a universal message in a way that maybe an accurate contemporary drawing would not, or an accurate contemporary sculpture would not. Although there are exceptions, we do have some art that depicts contemporary figures, especially at Epinal and Sicily, Rome American Cemetery. But for the most part, we use symbol very powerfully in our art. Here are some of the other works of art at Normandy American Cemetery. On your left, this is the mosaic ceiling inside the chapel. And you can see very powerful use of symbols here. You have Columbia representing America, bidding America's sons off to cross the Atlantic. You have a warship crossing to the Atlantic. And then an angelic figure reminiscent of Marianne. If Columbia is the female embodiment of America, Marianne serves the same role for the French, and she's there cradling a fallen soldier. And then to complete the circle, you have a troop ship carrying Americans back to America after they have won victory in World War II, leaving only and taking only enough ground to bury our dead. At the terminus of the main pathway that runs from the memorial building where the Youth Rising sculpture is through the chapel, the other terminus opposite the memorial building, you have two statues. Again, a figure of Columbia with an eagle and a figure of Marianne with a rooster, representing the two countries, America and our ally, and France, those that we liberated. In addition to the art, each of our World War II cemeteries has battle maps. Now, these appeared in our World War I works as well. They're largely for World War I on the monuments, not the cemeteries, except in cases where a cemetery is kind of geographically remote from the nearest monument. But we have battle maps representing the campaigns that those buried at that cemetery fought in at all of our World War II sites. And so just for context, here is the memorial building at Normandy American Cemetery. You can barely make out in this picture the Youth Rising statue in the center. And then in each of the wings are a number of battle maps depicting the D-Day landings in Normandy campaign. And if the grave plots represent sacrifice and the art conveys the meaning of that sacrifice, we really use these battle maps to inscribe in stone the achievements, adding to that meaning the achievements of those who are buried here, that these dead did not die in vain, that they died for a purpose and that they accomplished something amazing. Furthermore, while we use art extensively in our cemeteries, we like to think of our cemeteries themselves as their own work of art, where every element is designed to work in concert to create a very powerful emotional feel, a very powerful site of remembrance and honor and sacrifice for those visitors. And if you ever get a chance to visit Normandy American Cemetery or one of our other cemeteries, it is almost indescribable how powerful it can be to walk among those graves and view the art and view the battle maps. The other important part of our cemeteries that contributes to this as well is the power of place. So our cemeteries, unlike Arlington, are for the most part built on battlegrounds. They're built literally where the war went right through. They're built on ground that Americans liberated, and they're built on ground that Americans died to liberate. In this picture, you can see that beach on the top left. That's Omaha Beach. The bloodiest of the beaches on D-Day, where so many Americans fell. And many of them climbed that very bluff up to where this cemetery sits today. The first burials here were June 8th, 1944, only 48 hours after the landings. And you can see as well from this aerial shot the way these elements work in concert: the horticulture, the grave layouts, the memorial architecture, the art, the battle maps. So this cemetery is actually laid out. If you take the pathway that runs from the memorial building through that round building, which is the chapel, and then down to the statues of Marianne and Columbia, there's also a cross pathway that meets it at the chapel. And together those pathways form the shape of a Latin cross, just like most of the headstones in the grave plots. So a very deliberate design conducted by ABMC after the war before the dedications of these sites. Now, the most powerful element, however, is the individual burials. Each of these headstones represents an individual American and his story. And telling those stories and preserving their memory is an important part of ABMC's mission. It's not just keeping these sites so pristine and beautiful. It is also preserving and telling these stories to the next generation. So each individual headstone and each wall in the missing has its own story. I would also say, though, that for all the art at our sites and for all the careful design, this is the most powerful image, the most powerful design of the site. These perfectly aligned rows of crosses and stars of David, each one represents the individual buried there. But when you step back and look at this view, I would argue that this becomes almost something more than the sum of its parts, that this iconic view of the rows on rows of headstones conveys very powerfully, more powerfully than anything else, the scale of sacrifice. And that when you step back and view it in this way, this represents not just each individual buried under a headstone, but symbolically represents all the Americans who died in these wars and all those who fought beside them. Now, this is our centennial year. We have been maintaining these sites for 100 years. Side note, there was actually some discussion of ABMC being folded up after the completion of the World War I program, that we would turn these sites over once they were completed to be administered by the embassy of each country, by the State Department. And a couple of things prevented that from happening. First of all, President Roosevelt said that as long as General Pershing was alive, ABMC would exist. And then Pershing, of course, dies after World War II. And by the time of his death, it has become clear that ABMC's mission is not over. Also, the level of maintenance and care these sites require would have been so far beyond what the remote embassies could have done that it would not have justified, it would not have honored properly those who are buried here. And so for 100 years, the men and women of ABMC have cared for these sites. And so over that last 100 years, we've really been an organization focused on preservation and progress, preservation of the sites. And that is always going to be a mission. That is a permanent mission that will never go away, to keep these sites day in, day out, as beautiful and pristine as when they were first dedicated. And we work very hard at that. We have a huge amount of our budget that goes to the care of these sites. We have very dedicated crews, mostly locals of whatever country the cemetery is located in. They care for these sites every day and keep them pristine and beautiful. Day-to-day maintenance is not enough, and occasionally we'll have to do larger projects. Like if you can see on the right here, we completely resodded the entire Netherlands American Cemetery 2 years ago. And this is something that happens every couple of years at each of our sites. And it's becoming an increasing challenge to preserve these sites with climate change, especially some of our sites in Italy. The care required for the horticulture is becoming increasingly intense. And we're starting to look at how we can manage that and how we can kind of look at our horticulture and change some of our plantings to deal with that issue. It's not just the grass, though. We also have to care for the memorial architecture. Some of these sites are close to 100 years old now. And so occasionally we have to do restoration or preservation projects. And you can see here, they're working on preserving and restoring the battle map mosaic at Epinal American Cemetery. And so, these works of preservation are ongoing every day, as well as kind of larger ones to look ahead at what problems are coming, what problems we have, and make sure that these sites stay in a beautiful and pristine condition, worthy of those who are honored there. But the other thing we're seeing is that, in the 1920s for the World War I site, 1930s for the World War I sites, 1950s, 1960s for the World War II sites, our main audience was the families and those who had lived through the wars. And so, at that time, we were largely a grieving agency. We were helping Americans grieve and helping Americans honor the dead. As we get further and further away from these wars, when someone came to Normandy American Cemetery in 1960, you didn't need to explain World War II to them. They understood it. It was still part of lived history. Today, as we're getting further away and the World War II generation is dwindling and dwindling, we are transitioning from a sort of grieving organization to an educational organization, because now we do have to keep that story alive and we do have to share that story. And so we've got a number of initiatives over the last couple of decades as we transition, and we'll continue to transition as America changes and as these wars recede. So we have changed our focus to be much more interpretive, much more providing the context to help understand why these sites exist, who's there, how they died, and why it's important to remember them. So we have increased our interpretive staff on site, use of tours to school groups, to Americans visiting, both American descendants who are visiting their ancestors that they might not have never met, probably have never met, as well as general American public. Also have a huge amount of visitors from the host nations. And so we've expanded kind of that program to help interpret these stories and tell these stories. We've also been in the process of adding visitor centers to various our sites that use exhibits and artifacts to tell the history of the World War widely, but also of the specific campaigns that those who are buried at that specific site participated in. Normandy American Cemetery was actually our first. It was opened in 2007. And it was refreshed in 2019. as part of the 75th anniversary. Right now, we are currently working to open in December a new visitor center at Netherlands American Cemetery. And then our next big opening will be, we haven't even broken ground on this one yet, but hopefully for 2025, we are adding a interpretive visitor center to our Honolulu Memorial in Hawaii to tell the story of the Pacific War. So that's what we're doing on the sites to kind of keep these stories alive. But the problem that ABMC faces is that our sites are, for the most part, located overseas. But our audience, broadly speaking, is the American public, many of whom will never get the chance to visit one of our sites, let alone any of our sites. And so it's important that we work to bring these stories home and bring these sites home to the American people. So, and this has always been part of ABMC's mission. From the very beginning, after World War I, General Pershing, our first chairman, ordered the commission to prepare a history of the war and a guide to the battlefields. Much of the work of this was done by a young Army major called Dwight D. Eisenhower. We published the Guide to American Battlefields in Europe in 1927, and then the expanded, kind of completed volume, American Armies and Battlefields in Europe in 1938. More recently, we've continued this tradition with publications. So we published a single volume history of the European theater of World War II, as well as a single volume history of the Pacific theater of World War II. In 2018, as part of the centennial of World War I, we published a World War I battlefield companion that's divided into a number of tours to help you explore on the ground various parts of the World War I campaigns. As John mentioned at the beginning, most recently we published our centennial book, Time Will Not Dim, which tells the story of ABMC from its creation to the present day. Although it is not a narrative history that goes kind of year by year, it is organized into 3 sections talking about World War I program, World War II program, and our mission since the end of the World War II program to keep these stories alive and continue to expand our reach. It is organized largely as a art book that focuses on the use of art at our sites, as well as the history of those who built and designed these monuments. Even more recently, just last month, very excited to announce that we've launched on our website, abmc.gov, 360-degree virtual tours of all of our cemeteries, both World War I and World War II. And you can see a screenshot of that up there at the right. We also, for our centennial, completed a documentary that tells the story of the men and women who work at ABMC, and that is available on our website as well as our YouTube channel. And I hope you do get a chance to watch that. It's a wonderfully put together film. So that kind of takes us down to present day. And so now I think we've got, we took about 30 minutes to go through that. I'd like to open it up to any questions you have about anything I talked about in the presentation, or generically any questions about ABMC, because as John said, most Americans know very little, if anything, about us. When I first got hired here in 2019, I told all my family and friends, I was like, yeah, I just got a new job with American Battle Monuments Commissions. And the general reaction I got was like, wow, that's great. What is that? And so we've, in addition to the publications and the 360 tours, the other big thing we do is educational partnerships like this to tell our story to, organizations and groups that have, related missions.
Oh, thank you, man. That is fascinating. What great work your organization has done for a century. And I will throw out a testimonial for the documentary. It is great. It's just a thoroughly enjoyable thing to watch. I have not seen the virtual tours though, and I bet our boss, when you said that, immediately thought, "Oh, great! I just lost the education department for the next couple of days. They'll be staring at their computer, taking tours rather than working." But looking forward to spending some time looking at those as well. We had a couple of questions emailed in ahead of time. One's from our buddy Pete up in New Jersey, who asked, when were the European World War II cemeteries dedicated, and were they in a finished form when they were dedicated?
Yes. So, like I said, the World War I cemeteries were dedicated simultaneously in 1937, largely delayed because of the Great Depression. World War II construction takes about as long for the World War II sites as it does for the World War I sites. In this case, the biggest issue we have is that as the cemeteries are being designed, about a year after the repatriation and reburial program is finished, the Korean War breaks out. And so that sucks up a lot of the government's attention and a lot of the government's budget. And so our budget gets slashed every year during that, and we have to slow down construction. And so what you see end up happening is that the World War II sites are done in two waves, July of 1956 and July of 1960, about half of the sites in each. And then the one-off is Manila, our one cemetery for the Pacific Theater, is dedicated in December of 1960. The other thing you have going on is that because of the outbreak of the Korean War, the Honolulu Memorial, before it is even finished, is added to now include the missing in action for Korea. And that is not dedicated until 1966.
Okay, another question sent in through the comments.
Oh, sorry. And yes, they're completely finished, all construction done at the time of the dedication. The only thing that you will see different from now to when they were dedicated is that obviously much of the horticulture is still immature. And so that's the biggest difference. If you look at it overhead from Normandy at the dedication, you can see holes, little gaps in the grave plots that are set aside for horticulture, but it hasn't grown in yet.
Excellent. Although I imagine, like our memorial, to a certain point, it's never finished. There's always more work to do, and things to change and replace. So, but a question has come in also of all these cemetery sites. Do you have a favorite that's often overlooked and is lesser known than the others? I mean, like you say, many people visit Normandy American Cemetery, but what's your favorite beyond that?
Yeah, so I mean, I love, all of our sites. They're all very powerful. It's like kind of like picking a favorite kid, which is dangerous when your wife overhears. But I would say one of the ones that I like the most is Brittany American Cemetery, which is actually not far from Normandy American Cemetery, but gets a tiny fraction of the visitors. And I like that one for a number of reasons. First of all, it is somewhat unique in our sites in that much of our sites, uses marble, and the kind of overwhelming, architectural color is white. At Brittany, it is reminiscent of a, classic Normandy church, and everything is gray granite. The other fun thing about Brittany is that it is actually laid out intentionally to, from above, look like the sheath patch. And so the chapel forms the hilt of the sword. The walls of the missing form the cross piece. The central walkway is the blade. And then the grave plots themselves are the shield. And then there's a little bit of horticulture that mimics the rainbow at the top of the patch. I also like one of our one-off sites, Lafayette Escadrille Memorial, which we did not build. Lafayette Escadrille Memorial is a World War I site that honors those American aviators who flew for the French before America enters the war. And it's built by private donations from the French and American public and run by a private organization until 2017, when basically, 99 years after the end of the war, they're having trouble staying solvent, and ABMC takes over that site. But it is interesting because it is a gorgeous memorial. And then underneath the memorial is a crypt that has all the burials from those American flyers. There's a sarcophagus for each one who died, even if they're buried elsewhere. I think 58 of them are occupied, and the rest are representative of those who are buried elsewhere.
Excellent. One of our tour guides, Greg, asks, what is the origin of the quote, "Think not only of their passing, remember the glory of their spirit," which is also quoted here at the memorial on our one of our statues. So where did that come from?
I don't know off the top of my head where that came from. There's a bunch of inscriptions at Normandy. It might be from the Roll of Honor at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, but I'd have to double check what the sourcing is. I know
I always tell people it's from the Normandy American Cemetery.
It is. I don't think it's original to the site. I think it is drawn from somewhere else, but I'd have to look up where.
Okay. I think you'll probably like this question from our buddy Pete up in New Jersey. Why did ABMC fence off so much of Pointe du Hoc? It wasn't long ago that visitors could wander all over, and now it seems they're herded to only specific gun pits and emplacements. And then second, what happened to the sheep that were kept there to keep the grass mowed?
Safety. Short answer. Pointe du Hoc has been, is an incredibly important cultural resource, an incredibly important historic site, tells an incredibly important story of incredibly brave Americans. But we have been dealing with some significant safety issues, both, just from people running free on the site with all those craters and bunkers, but also the cliffs are literally falling apart. And so we're in the middle of going through a complete redo of that site, both from a preservation standpoint and from an interpretation standpoint. So we're in the middle of redoing all the interpretive panels, and then also doing some work to make sure that everything is stable. And as you note, restricting traffic drastically, basically to the walkways that are going to be now marked with more interpretive panels. But really the bottom line is safety and the preservation of the site. Primarily safety, but also, some concern that with just the increased traffic being able to free range, that it will, degrade the site and it will not be preserved in perpetuity. The sheep have been gone since before I joined the agency.
First time I went to Pointe du Hoc, there were kids, running down into the craters.
And
we understand the safety issue. How about the sheep?
I don't know about the sheep. The sheep have been gone since before I was joined the agency, so they've never been there in my experience.
Excellent. Pete asked another question. He had a conversation with the superintendent of the Margraten American Cemetery, and says that Margraten is unique in that each and every grave and every name on the wall of missing is adopted by a local family. Are there similar programs in France, Luxembourg, Italy, and other locations worldwide? And also offers the comment that, in his opinion, the Lorraine American Cemetery is the most beautiful of all of them.
I have not been to Lorraine yet. It is not one I've gone to, but it is, a gorgeous site, as all our sites are. So many of our sites do have people who adopt graves, but Netherlands is by far the most organized, and it is the only one where every single grave is adopted by a local family, and that dates back to before the dedication of the cemetery. That started, immediately after the war. But yeah, I think it's indicative that, these are American sites preserved by the American government, which is a myth we have to fight all the time. Every Memorial Day, you'll see stuff on social media about, how amazing it is that the French still honor us so much for their sacrifices, that they take care of these sites. And it's like, well, the guy cutting the grass is French, but he's getting a paycheck from the American government. It's the American government and the American people that owe this debt and will preserve it in perpetuity. But that's not to say that the locals aren't very closely tied to these sites. And they pass down the stories from those who lived through the war. When we were selecting the permanent cemeteries for World War II, there was a whole process of how these were chosen. And there was a criteria, they were largely chosen from the existing temporary sites. They had to be in an aesthetically pleasing area. They had to be tied to the actual operations of the war. And they had to be accessible to visitors, both locals and Americans. But the last cemetery cut from the program, as we found out the numbers of repatriation versus permanent interment, was one of the cemeteries in St. Marguerite in Normandy. and the town was devastated to lose what, this was almost 5 years after the war, to lose this connection to those who had liberated them. And the mayor of St. Mary-Galise actually asked the American government to leave a single unknown buried at that temporary site that they would take care of in perpetuity to honor that connection. And the American government, of course, said no, because these are our dead. This is our responsibility to care for them. But it just shows the power that, and the grave adoption program at Netherlands just shows the power of the connection between these local communities and these cemeteries.
I agree. It's a great story. Another question come in. How many Medal of Honor recipients are buried in Normandy American Cemetery? And then if you have
that's a great question.
Other ABMC sites.
I don't know off the top of my head, but I can tell you. So I know of 3 at Normandy, including one of our most famous, which is Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of President Theodore Roosevelt. And so for one, the Medal of Honor is the only distinction between headstones at our sites. Is recipients of the Medal of Honor have the engravings of their headstones etched in gold leaf rather than just etched straight into the marble. So if you're at one of our sites, they're visually distinct from others. Roosevelt in particular is one of our most interesting stories because his brother Quinton is killed in World War I. And Quinton is shot down behind German lines. The Germans bury him. When it comes time for families to designate whether they want their loved ones buried overseas or repatriated, President Roosevelt very famously says, let the tree lay where it fell. And he requests that Quinton be not moved at all, not permanently interred in one of our cemeteries, but left buried where the Germans buried him on the battlefield. Which a number of people did in World War I. There was a small number of people who requested isolated burials that the remains not be disturbed. So Quinton is left where he originally fell. When World War II occurs and Theodore Roosevelt Jr. dies, after the war, the Roosevelt family requests that Quinton be moved from his original site to lay side by side with his brother, which is a policy usually within a war. For World War II, we try and bury brothers side by side. And so ABMC told the Roosevelt family that, you elected for isolated burial. So, that was kind of a one-time choice. But if you as the family pay for the disinterment and movement, we will inter him at Normandy next to his brother. And so the family has him disinterred. And now Quinton rests side by side with his brother Theodore Jr. And it's the only case of a World War I soldier buried at a World War II site.
Very interesting. We got a lot of thank yous and comments on how informative and interesting this subject was, but I believe we're pretty close to out of time. So Ben, I want to thank you for this great presentation. I invite you to stop back in Bedford, first chance that you get. I know you visited here before, and we'd love to have you come back. But for all of you who've been watching this presentation, I encourage you again to visit the ABMC site, watch the documentary that they made, and learn more about their very important and very just selfless and really dedicated work that the ABMC has done for a century now. But Ben, again, thank you, and to all our viewers tuning in, thank you very much, and we hope we'll see you soon.
Thank you, John. And I will try and look up that Normandy quote and send it to you.
Oh, okay. Thank you.